Oh.
You're in practice session. Cannot join. I wonder until you start the webinar. So now it says the webinar's live.
There we go.
And I do have recording on. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining today. Look forward to an interesting presentation from c-path. My name is Keith Wenzel. I'll be moderating this session. Please mute your phones and don't put your line on hold. We'll be starting just after the top of the hour. Hi all, thanks for joining today. My name is Keith Wenzel, I'm your moderator. We will be starting a little bit after the top of the hour. Please mute your phones and don't put your line on hold. We look forward to an interesting presentation today. We'll be starting before 2. Good morning, good afternoon. This is Keith Wenzel. I'm your moderator today. We're just giving everybody a moment to join. We'll be starting just a little bit after the top of the hour. To ask a question, you can use the Q&A button today. Please, you are muted, but it would be a nice courtesy if you could also mute your phones just in case. And we'll be starting before too long. I see lots of familiar names, so thank you all for joining. The number of attendees is growing quickly here. We'll get started before too long. Hi all, thanks for joining. We are going to start just in one more minute, and please put your phones on mute and don't put us on a hold, please. All right, great. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Keith Wenzel. I will be your moderator today. I'm part of the educational series subcommittee of the DIA study endpoint community. We welcome you. We do encourage those of you who aren't DIA members to become DIA members. The cost is fairly modest, and DIA supports this platform so that we can have these educational presentations. We also, if you're interested in presenting on study endpoints or COA, you can see that Emila's address is, email address is on the screen. We would welcome proposals for future presentations. And we sometimes have this meeting monthly, sometimes it's less frequent, but we have kept up a cadence over the last couple of years, some very interesting presentations. We are recording this. We will post it on the DIA community website as well as on the c-path website. And with that, next slide, please. Right. It's a pleasure to welcome Sonya Eremenco and Paul O'Donoghue from the ePRO Consortium and the Critical Path Institute. The title of today's presentation is eCOA, Getting Better Together Initiative, an update from c-path Pro Consortium and ePRO Consortium. My name is Keith Wenzel. I'll be your moderator today. And next slide, please. So you've already seen this in the welcome slide, but please do mute your line. Video is already turned off. We will have Q&A. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. As the panelists are able to, they'll try to answer questions during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll try to ask as many of them at the end. And as you can see, a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. So good, I think we're ready for our next slide. Our first speaker is Sonya Eremenco. So Sonya, welcome this morning. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Keith, and thank you to the DIA Study Endpoints community for this opportunity to present today's webinar, eCOA Getting Better Together Initiative, an update from c-path PRO and ePRO Consortium. PRO Consortium and ePRO Consortium. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. In case this is the first time you are hearing about Critical Path Institute, the PRO Consortium, and the ePRO Consortium, we'd like to provide you with some background about who we are and what we do. Next slide. c-path is a public-private partnership which receives funding from the US FDA as well as non-governmental sources. Next slide. The contents presented here today are the views of each speaker and do not represent endorsement by FDA, HHS, or the US government. Next slide. Today's presentation will cover the following. I will start off by providing an overview of c-path, the ePRO Consortium, and the PRO Consortium for those who are not familiar with us. Next, Paul will present several important collaborations between these two consortia, specifically the eCOA Getting Better Together Initiative and the COVID-19 Risk Assessment and Mitigation Strategies, which are recommendations that we disseminated at the start of the pandemic in 2020. Next, I will discuss a number of upcoming presentations in collaboration with DIA on topics of potential interest to you. And finally, we will have questions and answers with the audience. Next slide. c-path is an independent, nonprofit organization which aims to accelerate medical product development through creating standards and drug development tools that aid in the scientific evaluation of the efficacy and safety of new therapies. c-path consists of over 16 consortia and other collaborative efforts, including stakeholders such as regulatory, industry, academia, patient organizations, and technology experts. The ePRO Consortium and PRO Consortium are two of these consortia. Next slide. Now I'll provide an overview of the Electronic Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium, or ePRO Consortium. Next slide. ePRO Consortium members are firms that provide electronic data collection technologies and services for capturing PRO and other COA data in clinical trials, along with c-path as the managing member. We will celebrate our 10-year anniversary as a consortium in March 2021. We advance the science of clinical trial endpoint assessment by delivering educational opportunities like this webinar and disseminating best practice recommendations through peer-reviewed publications and white papers, as well as by conducting research. We accomplish this through a pre-competitive collaborative environment, which brings together industry experts and thought leaders from all our member firms. Next slide. The ePRO Consortium has 13 member firms, which are represented on this slide. Next slide. The ePRO Consortium accomplishes its mission by engaging in activities such as collaborating with PRO Consortium member firm representatives, interacting with regulatory agencies, conducting eCOA studies, performing electronic implementation assessments, which are also known as migratability assessments, providing educational opportunities, and contributing to the scientific literature through research and best practice publications. Next slide. This slide lists our best practice white papers that are publicly available on the c-path website at the link shown here. These include migrating existing PRO measures to new modes, maximizing electronic options during development of new PRO measures, and electronic implementation of response skills. And Paul will talk in more detail about the COVID-19 document later in this presentation. Next slide. In addition to publications, we present webinars as part of our educational mission. These are some of our recent webinars on topics like submissions of eCOA documentation for ethics review, avoiding paper backup in clinical trials, and many more. We post the webinar slides and recordings as a free resource on the website shown earlier. We encourage you to take a look at the previous webinar topics, which may address challenges you may be facing with eCOA implementation in clinical trials. Next slide. Now I'd like to present an overview of the Patient-Reported Outcome Consortium, or PRO Consortium. Next slide. PRO Consortium members are pharmaceutical firms who work pretty competitively in collaboration with c-path, FDA, and other government agencies and patient organizations on the qualification of publicly available COAs for use in clinical trials where COA-based endpoints are used to support product labeling claims. Next slide. We currently have 24 member firms in the PRO Consortium as shown here. Next slide. The PRO Consortium governance consists of a coordinating committee, subcommittees, and working groups convened by the coordinating committee. The goal of these therapeutic area working groups is to generate and compile the evidence to enable new or existing COAs to be qualified by FDA for use in treatment trials to evaluate clinical benefit. There are 9 active working groups with 15 COAs in the qualification program, COA qualification program, including 12 PRO measures, 1 observer reported outcome measure, 1 performance outcome measure, and 1 activity monitor based outcome measure. Next slide. 4 of our working groups have completed their initial goal, which includes qualification by FDA of 2 asthma diaries and symptom measures for non-small cell lung cancer and depression for use in drug development. The consensus-defined MFSAF version 4 has been endorsed by FDA, although it was not formally qualified. These measures are actively being licensed for use in clinical trials. More details about these measures, including item content and available translations, as well as information about how to license them, can be found at the c-path.eu.org website. Next slide. We're really happy to announce the latest c-path measure to be qualified by FDA's COA qualification program, the Diary for Irritable Bowel Syndrome Symptoms, Constipation, or DIBC. It was qualified on December 18, 2020. Information is available on FDA's qualified c-path or qualified COA's website shown here, and licensing information on this measure will be added to the c-path COA's website in the coming months. IBS Working Group has 2 more measures in the qualification program, the DIBS-D for diarrhea predominant and the DIBS-M for mixed, so its work continues. Next slide. Now we'd like to get into the heart of today's presentation, which focuses on the collaborations between the ePRO Consortium and PRO Consortium that are underway. It is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Paul to dive into these collaborations. Take it away, Paul.
Many thanks, Sonya, and hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see many new and familiar names. I really appreciate you giving us some time today, and many thanks to echo what Sonya said to the DIA endpoints community to give us this opportunity to give you some more information around the kind of work we're doing over here in the ePRO Consortium and PRO Consortium. As you saw with a lot of the kind of goals and work that Sonya outlined that the various consortia are doing, by its very nature, there's quite a lot of collaboration going on already. But if we can go to the next slide, please. There really was a number of years ago a very deliberate and structured effort to put in place a work stream, basically, that would really foster a specific approach to collaboration between the PRO Consortium and the ePRO Consortium. And this really came out of a number of conversations and presentations, many of them at c-path's annual PRO workshop, where obviously the various consortia and members are brought together, where we tended to hear echoed both on the PRO Consortium side, which as you saw is mostly sponsors, and the ePRO Consortium side, which is mostly ePRO vendors, tending to hear common themes in regards to pain points in delivering eCOA studies, and really feeling within those rooms and within those consortia, we had people who were at the forefront of delivering these studies and running these studies. And so between us, feeling we probably had something valuable to bring to the broader industry. And so we kicked off what we've referred to as the Getting Better Together initiative. And the kind of what we're aiming to do is very much in the name. But it's structured as a collaborative, pre-competitive initiative, both kind of coordinated by c-path, but it's really involving the clinical trial sponsors from the ePRO Consortium, obviously the eCOA providers, as well as the various CROs involved in the eCOA, or the ePRO Consortium, and having the regulators, specifically the FDA, actively involved as well as being particularly important. And as I said, we're really looking to address some of those key pain points that we consistently heard again and again coming up in the running and delivery of eCOA, and attempting to tackle those pain points and coming up with guidance, recommendations, and we'll touch on exactly what we are coming up with, but various ways of trying to mitigate some of those pain points that would be applicable across the entire industry, so that we could actually drive some level of meaningful change across the industry, not just for the individuals involved in the work, but really clinical trials as a whole. Go to the next slide, please. So this is just really to illustrate quite how collaborative the whole process is. So we have a core leadership team, which is made up of key members of the ePRO Consortium and the ePRO Consortium. That obviously has a lot of representation from c-path. Sonya is key involved in that, and she feeds back to the various leadership teams within c-path, as well as a number of different groups and sub-consortia within c-path. But from that core leadership team, who is responsible really for coordinating and driving the work of the Getting Better Together initiative, we assign project liaisons, and they're basically people from the core leadership team who are providing oversight for each of the various projects, which I'm going to go into in more detail across the following slides. And they basically act as the go-between from the leadership team to those individual project teams. So they're really, providing the support the project teams need, as well as providing accountability back into the leadership team. And so each of those projects then has a team leader, typically 2 team leaders, in fact. Normally it's someone from the ePRO Consortium and someone from the ePRO Consortium. And they'll take an individual topic. They'll be responsible for running and delivering that topic, feeding back into the project liaison, who then feeds back into the core leadership team. All of this is really just to illustrate the very collaborative nature of the work we're attempting to do. The next slide, please. So we structured this we use the terminology of waves, and this is really our way of attempting to prioritize and focus on the work we're able to do in a given time frame. Obviously, there's finite resources and finite time for delivering any of this work, and so we have to prioritize what we wanted to focus on. And the things we wanted to focus on first, we refer to as Wave 1. And so that really was kicked off back in June 2019. And there were 5 main topics within Wave 1. There was the eCOA lexicon topic. There was the eCOA workflow topic. If we can go to the next slide, please. There was the best practice recommendations for user acceptance testing topic, best practice recommendations for ePRO dataset structure topic, and the best practice recommendations for changing eCOA data topic. And so I'm going to go into just a bit more detail about what each of these topics involve on the next 3 slides. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So topic 1 within Wave 1 was this eCOA lexicon topic. And this was really our way of baselining what the entire rest of the initiative, the Getting Better to initiative, was going to be doing. Because if we're not using the same language, or at least not understanding what each of us are saying, it was going to make it very difficult to collaborate and meaningfully talk about the things we needed to talk about. And so the goal out of this particular topic stream was to attempt to come up with a standardized list of definitions for the common words and phrases that we see coming up again and again within eCOA studies. And so we, as much as possible, were attempting to lean on existing glossaries and lexicons. There's plenty of those out there already. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And so we really worked to try and pull in existing definitions where possible. In some instances, we weren't able to find definitions for some very eCOA specific terminology. And so as a group, we generated those definitions. And another important aspect of this particular topic was it was working very collaboratively with the other topics within the Getting Better Together initiative, because as part of those topics work, they were coming up with new terminology, new words, new phrases that we wanted to ensure we were getting definitions from. And so we also got feedback from those groups around the kinds of things we need to include in this lexicon. And this topic's also a bit unusual because it's probably going to be ongoing across future waves of work within the Getting Better Together initiative. It's very much going to be a living document. Obviously, as more work is done in this area, new words and phrases will more than likely be turned up. And so we'll want to include those in the lexicon. And so the goal is really that as part of wave 2, 3 and beyond, the lexicon will proactively engage with those work streams and make sure any of the words and terminology that they're implementing in whatever deliverables they're creating will also be integrated into the lexicon. That said, we have version 1 of the lexicon finished and publicly available. It is available on the c-path website. There's a link here. There'll be a slide further on where you can get more details about where to access those. So I think this is a really important initial documentation, trying to just standardize the way we're talking about these eCOA studies, and certainly very keen for this work to continue across the rest of the work streams, and always looking for feedback from people around anything we want to miss. So you should always, once you've checked out that document, feel absolutely free to drop us a line if you think there's anything important we're missing from that lexicon that we can look to integrate into future versions. So that's topic 1. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as I said, topic 1 was a bit unusual because it was kind of very plugged into the other topics, and it's kind of going to be an ongoing effort. These topics were, you might call them a bit more standalone, a bit more self-contained. But topic 2 was a really important and huge topic, to be honest, the eco process workflow and roles responsibility topic. And this was really looking to try and clearly define as much as possible the entire workflow and process for successfully delivering an eCOA study, so that you could clearly outline the expectations, the roles, the responsibility as a way of mitigating some of these challenges that we were seeing as an industry around items being missed or dropped because there were assumptions being made about when they would happen or who was responsible for delivering them. As I said, this was a huge topic. It was really attempting to look at an entire clinical trial, basically, and how eCOA fit into that, and attempting to standardize both diagrammatically, but also verbally, exactly how that might be delivered, a best practice outline of how that might be delivered. An additional challenge for this particular topic was obviously within these consortia, there's not only different technologies being used, but also different standardized workflow processes within individual sponsor companies, for example. And so the goal was really try to make these documentation as generic as possible while not losing the value and not losing the guidance. And this is kind of a theme across all of these work streams and all of the work of the ePRO Consortium and the PRO Consortium. It's really trying to deliver meaningful guidance, but also not doing it in a way that's so prescriptive that you start making issues, creating additional challenges for specific technologies or specific processes that might be in place in a given company. And I think this particular topic really delivered on that. And so these documentation are also available on the c-path website. There's an abbreviations documentation. There's definitions of roles. There's a process step table, and then there's a workflow diagram as well, all available on the c-path website. So I think this is hugely valuable and an important work that's readily accessible now. Again, we'll provide more information around where you can get your hands on these later on. Next slide, please. Topic 3 was the best practice recommendations for user acceptance testing. UAT, consistent pain point within the world of eCOA. Anyone who's been involved in an eCOA study will know that UAT can be a challenge. It can be very difficult. And so there was a lot of interest in trying to provide guidance on how best to run UAT within the context of clinical trials, because within the context of eCOA, because there's specific considerations for eCOA studies that are very different to other technologies that might use some kind of UAT process. It's a very different world within eCOA. And so this writing team was generating a best practice recommendation document. This document is very nearly final. It has been prepared for submission to Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science for publication. Hopefully that will be accepted and published quite soon. I think this is a really important document for really outlining all those important and unique considerations for doing UAT in the context of eCOA. So again, keep an eye out for that. Hopefully will be coming out sooner rather than later. Next slide, please. Topic 4 was best practice recommendations for ePRO dataset structure and standardization. And this was kind of a very unique topic. It was coming off the back of feedback from a number of individuals and companies who are responsible for kind of handling various data sets, including eCOA data sets, and some of the consistent issues and challenges they were seeing with those data sets that were coming out of some of these eCOA systems, and really looking to try and kind of standardize how we are providing as eCOA providers, how we're actually providing these data sets to these companies, these sponsors, and obviously ultimately the regulators who want to be at some point looking at that data and being comfortable that they can actually trust what is in those data sets. So this is a writing team again that's looking to develop a best practice recommendation around how we actually can best structure these data sets to ensure some level of standardization across what sponsors will ultimately be submitting to regulators when they are running eCOA studies. So first draft has been completed. The goal is to have the final draft by the middle of this year, with hopefully some kind of virtual roundtable later on in the year as well, where these various topics can be discussed. It's a complex one. Again, harking back to this idea of making it generic enough that it can apply across all technologies while still being meaningful. And so I know that particular topic is navigating a lot of those challenges, but very important work, and really gets to the heart of what we're doing in regards to ensuring we're producing high quality, trustworthy data. Next slide, please. So topic 5 is another very interesting one and can immediately put people on edge when they see the title, recommendations for changing eCOA data. This topic is really looking at this issue that's kind of come off the back of specific regulatory feedback that we've heard in regards to who has ultimate control of the data set in a clinical trial, with the general sense within the regulatory community that it's sites that have that ultimate ownership and thus control of data collected within the context of the clinical trial. And what that means specifically within eCOA is that sometimes there is data for various reasons you might want to change within an eCOA system. So the most commonly offered suggestion is, something along the lines of you entered the wrong visit number for a particular patient, or a visit date you got incorrect. And so you might want to go back and update that. Where things get a bit more complicated and start straying into this gray area that seems to make up the majority of our world of eCOA is things around patient submitted data, for example. And that obviously puts many people on edge when we start thinking about changing patient submitted data. But again, you could think of various scenarios where arguably that might make sense. All of that is to say, this particular group is wrestling with all of those various considerations around how one would actually handle requests from sites in regards to changing COA data in general, but PRO data specifically. It's really trying to outline some very strong core principles that really kind of outline exactly the key things that we can and can't do in regards to clinical trials, and then trying to spin some recommendations off the back of those. This is a really great example of a collaboration, not just within c-path, but beyond. We learned that the eClinical Forum was working on a similar topic. They were exploring this topic of data change as well within the context of eCOA. And so we've now combined forces, and we're now collaborating with the eClinical Forum to deliver this particular best practice recommendation. And the goal is to get a manuscript out of that. No specific timeline on that, but as with all of these things, sooner rather than later. So those were the 5 topics for wave 1. So these are really the topics that we've either completed or we're deepest in or getting close to completing. But on the next slide, we'll look ahead to the next wave. So as I said, wave 1 was really the stuff we felt we had the time and resources to prioritize, and there was obviously elements of feeling what was most important that we wanted to work on as well. And so now we have turned our eyes as an initiative to wave 2. And so there's 4 main topics that we're interested in exploring in wave 2. I'm going to skip over the first 2 in this slide because I'm going to talk to them in more detail in the following slides. But priority 3, and this is not to say that one is necessarily more important than another, it's just how we've prioritized them as an initiative. Something around the topic of data management. It ties into the dataset structure topic that's already underway, as well as arguably the data change topic. But it's looking at it at a much higher level in regards to coming up with some best practices around how eCOA data should be managed from a eCOA provider, CRO, sponsor perspective. Obviously, all of these topics get scoped out in much more detail once we start digging into them, and some of these topics might get reprioritized as well. So bear that in mind as I'm sharing this information. And this is really just kind of high-level things of we'd quite like to do something on this. We don't know exactly what it is, and we don't know exactly when it will be. But at the moment, this is targeted for kicking off sometime in Q3 of this year. And then potentially in Q4 of this year, a site readiness and training topic. This is really building on work that the ePRO Consortium and PRO Consortium has already done in regards to best practices for training for eCOA studies. It was presented in a DIA forum actually back in 2019. But it's looking to try and expand and standardize those guidances that were already developed. This is a really important topic. Site readiness and training, we can consistently see if you get this piece right in an eCOA study, it just has so many knock-on positive benefits to the rest of the study. So I think it makes a lot of sense for us to as a collaboration, work on some best practices around this. So potentially looking to do that towards the end of this year. But let me turn to priority 1 and priority 2 in this wave 2, because these are 2 topics we've actually kicked off. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So this is wave 2, topic 1, supporting flexible approaches to PRO data collection. This is a really interesting topic. It's looking to explore how much flexibility we might be comfortable as an industry having within our eCOA studies in regards to how patients are engaging with the data collection process. So, clinical trials, constant battle against variability. We've had our own battles in the eCOA world in regards to comparing paper to electronic data capture, and does that introduce significant amounts of variability? I think we're largely kind of over that and we're comfortable it doesn't. We're seeing with Byod similar kind of echoes of, having multiple different devices within the same study. Does that introduce too much variability? Again, I think we're getting to a place where we're in many instances, assuming you're following various best practices, we're pretty comfortable that you're not going to see too much variability within a Byod study. But how much further can we push that? And how much more patient-centric can we be in regards to designing these studies to allow patients the flexibility to provide data in a whole host of different ways that might suit the patient more than the study team? But we really want to explore these topics. So this particular work group has just kicked off. The kickoff was the end of January. Currently going through the process of just scoping out exactly what this particular topic wants to focus on. Obviously, this is a very, very high level description here, so we need to clearly define what it is we want to work on and what the deliverables from this will be as well. But I think it's a fascinating work group, and I'm going to be watching this one closely because I think this could have a very meaningful impact in how we're running studies in the future. Next slide, please. And so the second topic within wave 2 is BYOD, which I already referenced, bring your own device. this, we've been talking about BYOD as an industry for almost coming up to a decade now. I think it's, we've all felt the pain of it maybe moving a bit slower than we thought it would do. Certainly in the early days, BYOD was going to be the next big thing. And while it's certainly becoming much more mainstream now, and we're much more comfortable delivering BYOD studies, we're still lacking some really clear industry level guidance on the best practices around how we deliver these studies. And from my perspective, it's certainly, there's an argument to be made. It's not actually the technology piece that's challenging BYOD. It's everything that goes around it in supporting the delivery of those BYOD studies from kind of a logistics and operational point of view. And so I think it's really important that, again, we use this collaborative effort to clearly outline some of those best practices and considerations for what you need to bear in mind for a successful delivery of a BYOD study. Again, this one's just kicked off. It was last week, I think, was the first kickoff meeting for this particular topic. So only at very early stages, defining exactly what we're going to be looking at, what the deliverables will be. But again, hopefully by the end of this year, this will be well on its way, and we'll have some form of best practice or recommendation coming out of this work, which I think will be very, very important. Next slide, please. And then looking much beyond that, so obviously wave 3 follows wave 2. Realistically, these won't be kicking off until 2022, maybe 2023 for further on topics. And as I mentioned when I was describing wave 2, these are just very high level, these are basically a group of us going, oh, it'd be quite nice if we did something on this. So we haven't got beyond suggesting various interesting topics we think would be valuable and useful for us to work collaboratively on. And this priority list is not a priority list. Any of these might shift priority or might drop off altogether or be replaced by something else. But some of the things that we're interested in exploring in later work groups are the RFP process, the request for proposal. Every different sponsor tends to have a different RFP process, which is very painful for us as eCOA providers. And so looking to try and kind of standardize the approach to RFPs would certainly go a long way towards simplifying the process, both for the eCOA providers, but also arguably make it simpler for sponsors when they're trying to compare eCOA providers. Design requirements around actually developing the eCOA system and creating some kind of best practices around how you actually define that content within the design of the system and delivering the system. Obviously, that's a key component of any success. So some kind of best practices around that. Data transfers, key aspect of eCOA studies is getting the data off the devices ultimately into the study EDC. And so developing some kind of a noted data transfer agreement template that can be used across the industry, as well as best practice recommendations around operationalizing those data transfer features is clearly would bring value. eCOA compliance thresholds, this is really talking about that issue of setting thresholds for what's considered too much missing data, for example, and just ensuring that your compliance rates are consistently high with eCOA studies, within eCOA studies. Obviously, this is one of the key benefits we constantly talk about within eCOA is the positive effect of the technology has on compliance, but really digging into that topic in more detail in regards to the impact that then that ultimately has on, for example, your statistical analysis plan and the ultimate quality of your data. And a topic as well suggests around approaches to optimizing timelines and efficiencies for eCOA deployment. So key pain point for everyone involved in eCOA studies, how long it takes to get a study up and running, and really exploring this. This in fact builds off the work already done in regards to defining that workflow and roles and responsibilities, but really trying to dig into some of those specific aspects of the delivery of those studies to see is there anywhere we can introduce more efficiencies and maybe improve and speed up how we're delivering those studies. All of that to say is that's obviously very much future looking. These won't begin to kick off until 2022 at the earliest. And as I said, any of these might shift around and new ones might get added in. But just to give you a sense of the kind of things that we're looking to work on in the future, and very much this is a long-term initiative we have going on here. Right, next slide, please. This is just highlighting where you can get access to this documentation that I already indicated was available, specifically the lexicon, version 1 of the lexicon, as well as the documentation for the workflow and roles and responsibility task force or topic group that is available on the c-path website. The links are here, and you can see in the middle of your screen specifically where you can actually find those on the website. So you will have access to these slides following the presentation. Please do check them out, provide us feedback. There's no point us producing these unless people actually use them. So really keen to hear people's thoughts on how you're using them, how we can improve, how we can make them more useful, and thoughts on anything else we should be focusing on in the Getting Better Together initiative. So do check those out. Next slide, please. Before I hand back to Sonya, I just very quickly want to call out another specific example of really close collaboration that we did as the ePRO Consortium and ePRO Consortium. It's a really nice case study, I think. Obviously, early this year, and if we can go to the next slide, please. Not early this year, early last year, even though it feels kind of like this year or the last decade, when the pandemic was really kicking in and lockdowns were really kicking in. Many of the study teams we were working with were literally overnight faced with a situation of patients no longer being able to go in for site visits, often those site visits being a key data collection point. And so the entire integrity of the clinical trials were suddenly threatened because they weren't going to be able to collect data during those site visits. And this was very obviously an opportunity where various technology solutions might be able to mitigate some of that impact. So obviously there was a patient safety issue. That was the most important thing to be addressed. But then there was this kind of data integrity, study integrity piece around trying to maintain some level of flow of data. And so very quickly, the ePRO Consortium and the ePRO Consortium got together to come up with some level of risk mitigation, as well as providing and detailing options in regards to how one might respond to this issue, whether it's having patients submit data over the phone, using some kind of web-based system, using some kind of BYOD system. We very quickly outlined the various risk considerations we had in mind, because we were both a combination of sponsors and eCOA providers. We were very much on the ground and trying to respond to a lot of this. We were also responding and providing feedback to some of the regulatory pieces that were coming out. You know, the regulators responded very quickly themselves to this particular issue, and I think with praiseworthy flexibility as well. And so we put together a documentation. If we can go to the next slide, please. We put together a documentation that you can also find on the c-path website, which kind of outlines the various considerations and pros and cons of various response options that were outlined there. We also presented on this, and we did a really interesting presentation where we kind of had a bit of a lessons learned, where some of the sponsors who had implemented some of the recommendations from this guidance shared some information around what that experience was like within their clinical trials. So that recording is also available on the c-path website. So just really wanted to call that out as a wonderful example of the power of collaboration, because it you know, was bringing together those who were dealing with the issue, but it also responded really quickly. And I think that's, you know, one of the things we always say about collaboration. It can move slowly, and that's true. But this was a wonderful example of where we moved remarkably quickly and produced some very important and powerful work. So please do check that out as well. So with that, we can go to the next slide, please. I'm delighted to hand back to Sonya, who's going to talk a bit more specifically about collaboration with DIA. Sonya.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that excellent review of the eCOA Getting Better Together initiative and COVID-19 collaboration efforts. In this last section of the webinar, I'd like to share some upcoming presentations being made in conjunction with DIA that provide more in-depth discussion on a number of important topics. Next slide. As a follow-up to the Digital Technology and Clinical Trials Conference that ePRO Consortium co-sponsored with DIA in August of 2020, there will be a webinar event on April 30th, 2021. It's called DIA's Meet the Experts Digital Technology and Clinical Trials Knowledge Exchange. Recordings of 2 of the most watched sessions from the August meeting will be replayed during the session, followed by live Q&A with all of the panelists from both presentations. The session will look at clinical and analytical validation as well as meaningfulness of technology-driven measures. The latter portion includes both sponsor and eCOA provider representatives from the ePRO Consortium and PRO Consortium, as well as Paul and myself, discussing methods and challenges in determining what is meaningful to patients that can be measured using remote monitoring technologies. We encourage you to register for this thought-provoking session. Next slide. So at the 2021 DIA Global Annual Meeting coming up in June, the 2 consortia will jointly present a short course titled eCOA 102, Beyond the Basics, Operational, Scientific, and Best Practices for eCOA and Wearable Devices in Clinical Trials. This short course was created by popular demand as a follow-up to our successful eCOA 101 short course, which has been presented twice. Attendees of eCOA 101 requested more information on operational aspects as well as scientific information on wearable devices and their use in clinical trials. The short course will include a recap of eCOA 101 for those who did not attend it and as a refresher for previous attendees because it's been a few years since it was held. It will also include updates on current thinking with regard to comparability between modes of data collection, that's always a hot topic, and other scientific and regulatory topics. The short course will take place June 23rd from 2 to 5 p.m. and registration is open at the link shown here. Next slide. From the PRO Consortium side of things, there will be a forum session on the Rare Disease Clinical Outcome Assessment Consortium, which is being incubated within the PRO Consortium's Rare Disease Subcommittee. This forum will describe the unmet need that this new consortium seeks to address and also describe the rare disease COA resource in development. The COA resource will be publicly available and is intended to be a compilation of potentially fit-for-purpose COAs that can be used, or it's information about these potentially fit-for-purpose COAs that can be used across rare diseases. It is being developed following a domain approach, and its current focus is on pediatric daily function. Attend this forum to learn more about the process of developing the resource, the subdomains included, and progress to date. The forum will also include findings of a literature review to identify measurement approaches to deal with heterogeneity. This forum will take place on June 30th from 4 to 5 p.m. and you do need to register for the DIA Global Annual Meeting in order to attend it. Next slide. So following up on the success of last year's conference, DIA is holding the second Digital Technology and Clinical Trials Conference on October 28th and 29th, 2021. The ePRO Consortium is co-sponsoring the conference once again, and we have members who are represented on the steering and planning committees. Our goal is to make this virtual conference interactive and solutions-driven to address the challenges we are currently facing with implementing digital technology in clinical trials. Stay tuned for more information on this conference, including a call for abstracts in the coming weeks. Now it's my pleasure to hand it back to Keith to moderate our Q&A discussion. Thank you.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Sonia, and thanks, Paul. Very much appreciate the update from the PRO and ePRO consortia. Really a lot of good work here. This work is led by c-path with all these different organizations. As Stephen Coons put the flag in the ground 10 years ago, followed by Jason Lindy, and most recently Sonya. So credit to all of them and all of the support staff behind the scenes that they've really done a wonderful job. And truly, it's been a nice collaboration by the industry for the last decade that's really, as you've seen, generated real outcomes, no pun intended. So then a couple of questions for both of you. And as a reminder, I see one question has come in on Q&A. Maybe we can start with that, but you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. The first one is, how do you deal with BYOD for pediatric studies where adolescents are completing the PRO themselves? Do you supply the child? And who pays for the data usage? Good question.
Yeah, way to start with a really difficult question, Gabe. No, it's a great question. And there's no kind of clear guidance. And I think part of exactly what we're presenting is that the topic around BYOD in general, but specifically PED studies, not even within BYOD, I think eCOA more broadly, although Sonya, this is potentially a topic you can talk on in more detail. I think PED studies are an area where, you know, we could probably do more as an industry to be much more collaborative and standardized in how we're thinking about them. But specifically in regards to your question around how do we deal with BYOD within those PED studies and within adolescent studies, I think first of all, it's worth calling out that obviously depending on your age range, but adolescents are very often the most tech savvy people on the planet, and so are very comfortable using their own devices for accessing information around studies or accessing their questionnaires. You know, arguably they're so tech savvy that in fact they'll find our kind of clinical based systems not all that interesting to engage with. And so I think there's a really interesting question there around how we're actually structuring those systems, the eCOA systems. And as an eCOA provider, I can put my hand up as being somewhat guilty to this as well. I've traditionally been very, very stripped back and very, very limited in regards to functionality and limited in regards to what they're attempting to do. And there's a reason for that. But I also think, you know, we need to maybe explore potential for being a bit more flexible in that regards. But yeah, specifically for BYOD in adolescents, as with any BYOD study, you know, we would be letting adolescents use their own device where they were comfortable, but we would be provisioning devices alongside that for those who didn't want to use their own device, or obviously the younger people who mightn't have a device. But then at that point, you're typically flipping over into maybe having the parent or caregiver respond on behalf of the child or collaboratively with the child. So you might use the parent's own device. All of that to say is it's very rare, if not almost never happening, where we would have a 100% BYOD study. You're always looking to provision some level of provision devices alongside the BYOD option, because you will, in a study of any decent size, run into patients who don't have a suitable device or don't want to use their own device. So we need to respect that and be able to support that, and that applies just as much to BYOD in PEDs and adolescents. In regards to who pays for any data, obviously you want to make sure patients are not out of pocket in this regards. It's worth saying that eCOA data is absolutely tiny in regards to the amount of data that's being sent, because it's literally just, you know, numbers, a small number of numbers that's being sent from the device. And so we don't typically see, particularly in a very data-rich world that we live in, or at least in the Western world, we don't typically see any kind of meaningful impact on data plans from eCOA data when it's being sent. But you do want to bear that in mind, that you don't want people to be out of pocket or stuck without being able to send data. And so having some kind of reimbursement plan there is typically how that's dealt with within a BYOD setting, because obviously you want the patient to continue using their own SIM card, because giving them a SIM card would tend to mitigate the value they might be seeing there, because they would obviously probably swap between SIM cards. So that's a very long-winded way of saying it's complicated, but great question.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And Sonya,
yeah.
Do you want to comment as well?
I do, yes, thanks. I really appreciate Paul's explanation, and it is complicated. I just would say, in terms of the role of the parent and use of the parent's device, I think that is a tricky situation, because we don't want the parent answering for the child. We really want the child or the adolescent to answer for themselves. And so I think that this is a great question, and something we can definitely take back to the BYOD team, because they're just getting started with scoping it out, and they're really trying to identify all the key questions that need to be answered by that group. So we can definitely take it back. I do think that what Paul was getting at, with there's going to be some provisioning, that's going to be the case. I firmly believe that for the time being, there's always going to be some provisioning in BYOD studies, because there's going to be people who don't have the right kind of phone. it doesn't have the right operating system, maybe it's old, maybe they don't have any room on their phone. You know, people fill it up with apps and photos and downloads, and they may not have room. So there's so many reasons why someone may not be able to use their own phones. I think having, assuming some percentage of provisioning is going to be the case. But what we've seen, I can just speak to adolescents in particular, in our asthma work, it included patients from age 12 and up. So 12 to 17 was a key demographic, and then we had adults over 18 in our study, so that the asthma measure that's been qualified is for use with adolescents, and we did use provision devices, and we saw no issues. So they were perfectly fine with using provision devices. And one of the newer working groups, pediatric asthma, one of the target populations is children from age 8 to 11. And our goal is to have them answer the diary on their own with a provision device, most likely, at least at this stage. So we haven't gotten to that stage yet. We're still doing the qualitative work on the content of the diary, but we look forward to working to doing quantitative research in the near future, and we'll be exploring the use of devices with children from 8 to 11. So we will be gathering more information. But I think I think what it comes down to is if the child has their own device, if the adolescent does, which I think is probably more and more common these days, they're more likely going to want to use it and not have a second device. So that's the other side of the coin of why there's so much interest in BYOD is many people don't want to have to carry two different devices around.
At the end of the day, we don't want to. At the end of the day, we don't want to limit the potential subject participation because of a device. And I think it's really encouraging to hear that you've got some experience. So that'll probably soothe people's minds on the call today. Quick question for you, Sonya, about membership. For the different consortiums, membership, if people are interested in joining, are both open for additional members? Are there any restrictions?
So membership in each of the consortia is based on the organization. So it's the organization that's a member, and then individuals who are employees of that organization are member representatives. So for the PRO consortium, the members are pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies. So they have to be, or medical device companies, they have to be that kind of company. With the ePRO consortium, members are those who provide either data collection technology or services. So we have several CROs that are part of the ePRO consortium. And Mappy Research Trust is a newer member and they provide services, but not necessarily the technology. So the ePRO consortium is a little broader in terms of who can join. And we're definitely open to new members. We'd be happy to speak with anyone who is interested. You can reach out. We'll have, and maybe this is the time to go to the next slide, Christian, that has our contact information. You can reach out to us if you have questions about joining either of the consortia.
The more the merrier.
Yeah, okay, good to hear. We do have a few more questions. We're gonna have to do quick hits if we're gonna make it all the way through them. Yep. First one, I think is Paul. When will the formal UAT guidance be available? This is a very hot topic in the translation and testing environment.
I'll leave that one to Sonya.
Yeah, I'm actually close to that one. Okay. So we are very close to submitting it to the journal for publication consideration. So it can take several months for the review cycle to happen and then possibly revision. So, assuming we get it submitted this month, I'm hoping that we will have a decision on that probably by the summer or the fall at the latest. So sometime later this year.
Okay, good. The next ones may not be quick hits for answers. Have you or anyone in the group been working with health authorities on different modes of administration used in ongoing trials during COVID that otherwise would not have happened? Are they more willing to accept different modes under unexpected situations?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly, the things we were tackling in that COVID working group was exactly, we're suddenly implementing, we're not just mixing modes, so we're not just now introducing a new technology or a new way of capturing data in the study. Arguably in some circumstances, we were introducing what in other circumstances would be considered a suboptimal solution. And we, outlined all of that in the documentation. I would encourage that person to check out that particular documentation. But I think in regards to the regulatory attitude, as I mentioned, my perception, could be wildly wrong, but my perception, particularly when you read through the guidance that the regulators put out there, was that they were much more flexible than maybe we're used to in regards to using technology as a way of mitigating some of these challenges. And they were very much open to hearing solutions. And I think based on what we've heard from some of our sponsors who had to implement some of these solutions, I think it is being received, maybe positive is too strong a word, but it's certainly being received, I think, in the way it should be received, which is we were responding to an emergency and a crisis. Sonya, I don't know what your take on it is there.
Yeah, I completely agree, Paul. I think, and that's part of why we did the work we did for the COVID-19 recommendations, was to try to provide reassurance to sponsors and eco providers about the situation, and also to provide, we do go into some of the regulatory expectations and also the ethical, the IRB expectations of what IRBs need to see done. But we do think that one of the key things is to track or flag the data and how it's being collected, so that at the end of the day you can analyze it, with and without, or do sensitivity analyses. As long as you flag it and you kind of can trace it, that gives you more options of how to handle the data at the end of the day. So that was a really important key thing to do.
All right, great. Let's try to squeeze in one more. Another toughie. How do you approach system validation in studies with Byod? The software part is a separate thing, of course. Does the device play a role? I believe much of the research over the last decade has shown that modalities and screen size within reason doesn't really impact how the users respond and doesn't bias them one way or the other. Any other comments you want to add to that?
Well, my normal infuriating comment of it, depending what you mean by validation, but yes, if referring to that issue of comparability across the fact, this patient will have a 4-inch screen device, this patient will have a 5.5-inch screen device. The data very much suggests, including work done by c-path, that patients answer consistently across those devices. So if we're talking about validation in that context, the trend within the industry is towards, as long as you're following best practices in regards to migration and implementation, we're not as concerned by that as an issue. And there is, in fact, updated guidance under work at the moment with a number of people on this call to kind of outline that industry approach.
I just want to add, though, that to me, from a UAT perspective, when I hear system validation, I think UAT.
Yeah.
I would think that you would want to try to test some different device types, so an Android and Apple iOS operating system and different screen sizes during your UAT, just to see that it's working correctly. So I think some of that is needed, although you can't test them all. I mean, I know that's the reality. You can't test everything, and that's where it becomes a challenge. But I think having sort of categories would be helpful.
Yeah, user testing is really an important part of this, the usability. All right, so final question, and then we'll wrap up because we're a minute after. It's actually a comment. Thank you, Katie. She indicates that, interestingly, with respect to the question above, that's about the Byod, one of the questions. I've done some research with sites and asked if participants using Byod were concerned about the data usage, and they said no. So that's about the reimbursement or need to reimburse patients, subjects for Byod data fees. But they weren't pediatric studies. So thank you for that comment, Katie. And thank you to our presenters today, Sonya and Paul. As you see, their contact information is on the screen. For those of you who aren't members, please consider becoming members of the ePRO or PRO Consortium and the DIA's study endpoint community. We have this educational presentation at least quarterly, so we would welcome you. We will post the slides on the various websites. Paul and Sonya, great presentation. We had over 70 attendees, so very successful. Thank you again, and have a good day.
Thanks so much
everyone.
for the
Have a great,
Thanks, everyone.
great day.
Take care.